Okay, here we are. 4 months after Trump has been inaugurated, and after 2 years of hearing him on the campaign trail and then going into office about how he would end the war before he was inaugurated, and then end the war in 24 hours, and then end the war in 100 days, or if he was president, the war would have never happened to begin with. After all of this, going around and portraying Trump as the great peacemaker of our time who is going to change the face of diplomacy forever through his peacemaking that will inevitably earn him a Nobel Prize and the respect of his peers and all of the fame and attention that he could have ever wanted. The Vice President of the United States has now said that the war in Ukraine, and I quote, not ending anytime soon. Let me read you the full quote. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance has said the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon in an interview with Fox News. Vance said the question facing the U.S. administration now was how it could help Russia and Ukraine find the middle ground. Find the middle ground to end the conflict that has been raging for more than 3 years. But Vance added it's going to be up to Russia and Ukraine to come to an agreement and stop this brutal, brutal conflict. Now, let me read a little bit more because there's, in this section, you get a little bit of his logic into this, which I just thought was exquisite. Vance made the comments in a wide-ranging interview in which he defended Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine. Yes, of course, the Ukrainians are angry that they are invaded, he said. But are we going to continue to lose thousands and thousands of soldiers over a few miles of territory this or that way? Who's we? Who's we? No American soldier in uniform has died. We have not lost a single Marine, not a single infantryman, nobody in the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force. Every American that has died in reference to this war are either journalists, aid workers, or foreign volunteers who came and joined the Ukrainian armed services because they believed in the values of their struggle. So when he says we, it's not we, okay, any more than it's we paying when, you go to the store and you pay for my meal. It's not we paying, it's you paying. It's them losing thousands and thousands of soldiers. And when he says over a few miles of territory this or that way, to be clear, what's being fought over in the immediate sense in any daily battle is going to be a few miles of territory. But the Russians have made clear time and time and time again that they haven't moved off their position whatsoever since the start of negotiation with Trump. At the start of Trump's negotiating with the Russians, he was talking about implementing sanctions to bring them to the table, and he was talking about going out there and negotiating the best deal possible in favor of Ukraine. He even said publicly he would try to negotiate as much land of their land back as possible, indicating that Trump was going to go over there and maybe get back the rest of Kherson and Zaporizhia to the Ukrainians, or make some deal to get back, the swaths of Luhansk and Donetsk that's been lost since the 2022 large-scale invasion. But now when J.D. Vance talks about this, he goes on to say, there'll be maybe a few little territorial shifts here and there, which I suspect to mean that the Russians will lose Kharkiv. They'll pull out of Kharkiv in return for, or I don't even know if they pull out of Kharkiv. That's what I would assume. They pull out of Volchansk, they pull out of Lipsy, and they pull out of maybe some of the area around Kupiansk or something. I don't know. In return for the Ukrainians pulling out of Belgorod and the last few positions they have in Kursk. That's what I would imagine it is. But of course, I'm making some assumptions here. But I don't think that's the most that Trump could have negotiated. Maybe it's the most Trump could have negotiated without applying any pressure, without ever pulling the trigger on any of the sanctions, without sending a new aid package, without making a statement that after getting elected, and not just on the campaign trail, that if the Russians don't come to the table, he's going to supercharge the Ukrainians on trade. Because now that the Ukrainians have delivered Washington everything that they wanted, They've delivered them almost every single thing. The only thing they haven't delivered is we will recognize the annexation of Crimea. They had to deal with NATO membership being taken off the table by the Trump administration. They had to deal with Ukraine being excluded from these one-on-one talks and watching the United States pursue normalization on a bilateral basis, on a unilateral basis, not a bilateral basis. They had to watch as the United States cut off aid and support to Ukraine, only for them to agree to America's, okay, we'll do a 30-day ceasefire, which Russia then did not agree to, and then no consequences were borne on them. Ukraine took the tariffs from the United States that was placed on them and not placed on Russia, and just kept going, kept smiling, did not insult the Trump administration, and result to it, did not retaliate, as Trump requested of every nation that they place tariffs on. And now the Ukrainians have even agreed to the mineral deal, signing it, meaning that the United States is going to be profiting off the mineral wealth of Ukraine. So that also gives Trump a political victory at a time where, I mean, we're seeing polls that have him in the 30s. AP had him at 39. Fox News has him in the low 40s. Nobody has him up. He's polling the worst of this honeymoon period in the first 100 days of his presidency than any other president at this point outside of first-term Trump. Actually, I think the 30s, being in the 30s at this point, might actually even be worse than that if we take the Associated Press polling at face value. So the Ukrainians have delivered Trump a victory. They have watched Trump continue to give concessions to the Russians, concessions that they've been demanding for a very long time, including stuff on NATO membership. And in return, the Russians have blown up the ceasefires that they have agreed to them, agreed to one thing about civilian ceasefires in public and do another thing in private, agreed to one thing about entity ceasefires in private, and then it's announced another thing in public. Reject the ceasefire offers of the United States, be told to accept an unconditional ceasefire, respond sure, and then give a list of conditions which directly contradicts the idea of an unconditional ceasefire, which should not have conditions. And so outside of the recognition of the annexation of Crimea, which would have to go through the Ukrainian Rada as dictated by the Ukrainian Constitution, so it's not even something Zelensky even has the unilateral power to just give the Trump administration. Hell, even the mineral deal is going to have to pass through the Rada probably between the 13th and the 15th of this month. Besides that, which would have been a territorial concession acknowledged by the Ukrainians in return, again, for nothing, the Ukrainians have played ball on everything. They've played ball. They did the mineral deal. They watched all the concessions be done. They went forward with the ceasefires that Trump wanted. And the Russians didn't play ball. They agreed to one thing in private with Trump and then disrespected that in public twice. They continue to perpetuate this, drag their feet on negotiating. So at what point does the Trump administration acknowledge that the Russians don't want peace? Well, okay, it looks like we've heard some statements from Trump that maybe they don't want peace, and then Trump will flip-flop it a little bit later. We're now hearing from J.D. Vance that the war doesn't look like it's any closer to being finished, and, you know, peace is a long way away. Peace dying a quiet death here. And so there seems to be a tacit acknowledgement on multiple people at the top of the Trump administration, from Trump to J.D. Vance, that the Russians might not actually be the misunderstood, you know, Saturday night cartoon misfit that they have been led to believe. That them simply walking into the room and offering peace through the mouth of Donald Trump, Putin's friend, who Putin prayed for and gave paintings of himself to, might not actually be enough. It's not just going to take a little bit of elbow grease, because the Russians are still demanding demilitarization officially. They're still demanding the annexation of every region they have any occupation of, outside of Kharkiv, which if they could get, they'd still take. That means Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, on top of Crimea. It means cities of 700,000 people that are not occupied being handed over. These are concessions that cannot be given. They want a river crossing across the Dnieper, and it seems that reality has checked into the station. It has come in, it's parked, and it said the Russians are not looking for immediate peace. So, what now? Well, now that it's being implicitly accepted, what is the Trump administration supposed to do? Well, if we go by what they said on the campaign trail, now comes the sanctions. Now comes, okay, we're going to place sanctions on their energy industry. We're going to ramp up the sanctions, and we're going to ramp up the support for Ukraine. That would be the next step, because that would take the power, the Russians, who are not wanting to come to the table and agree to a ceasefire and agree to a peace. It gives them a worse option when it comes to continuing the war. If they think the United States is just going to walk away, as has been at least semi-suggested and has been assumed, if the United States doesn't just walk away from the peace process, but walks away from the war entirely, then from the Russian perspective, you're losing on the other side of your enemy side, like 40% of the aid that was coming to Ukraine, military aid, was coming from the United States. You're losing possibly the ability to re-export American military equipment that has been sold to these weapons to Ukraine, as happened with the American Abrams that Australia was going to decommission and that Ukraine wanted for spare parts. You know what happened to that? The United States blocked it. And so if you're in Russia's position and you can, get America to walk away, still pursue normalization, and block aid packages from other countries, well, then what motivation do you have to stop the incursion, to stop the invasion, to stop continuing to pursue the conquering of Pokrovsk, Konstantinivka, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, whatever? Why wouldn't you? Because from your perspective, if Europe cannot make up for it, and other powers like, say, the Turks or the South Koreans, which I doubt immensely, don't make up for it with their own artillery shells, with their own exports to Ukraine, then Ukraine's going to be in a worse position when it comes to supply. And if the economic screws are removed from the Russians, then it's not just that the Ukrainians are getting less support. It's not just the re-export of weapons from even allied countries who still want to support Ukraine might be stopped. It could also mean that Russia could be importing American CNC machines, which could help prepare the weapons and the defense industry for expansions of artillery production, for expansions of drone production, for expansion of missile production, which will then be fired at Ukraine, the nation that we asked to get rid of their atomic arsenal, and we assured this wouldn't happen. So at this point, that's what they're supposed to do. Increase the screws to make the Russians know, well, if we continue to pursue this, the situation will only get worse for us. The toll on our economy will only get more mighty. The toll on our civilian population will only grow. Public opposition to the war in Russia could rise. And at the end of the day, running to pursue a fool's errand is worse than cutting your losses and trying to serve what they have been able to get as some sort of a victory. Like, for example, even here's my radical take. Let's say that Trump went to the table and said, hey, look, okay, we're not going to push you out of Crimea, but you're going to go back to 2022 lines. We're not going to have Ukraine join NATO. We're going to put some security arrangements in place. And we're going to talk about maybe some language stuff so you can, talk about that at home. But you're not going to invade Ukraine again. Because we're going to have these security agreements in place. And so you get to have Crimea for now. You get to go back to holding parts of Donetsk and Luhansk. You got to go back to 2022 lines. If you don't, we're going to send $100 billion in support to Ukraine. And we're going to enact secondary sanctions of 500% on the export of gas, making it so Chinese companies might be a little fearful of working with you. If that is what Trump put forward, and you're Vladimir Putin, and you're looking down that barrel, and you believe Trump, and you don't just cry his bluff, and Trump starts to deliver, and you start to say, oh, snap, he's actually going to do it? What is better for the survival of your regime? Saying, hey, we destroyed the majority of NATO's artillery stockpile. We destroyed all these Western tanks. We destroyed all this Western gear. Our goal was demilitarization. We demilitarized NATO. Now they cannot invade us for a decade due to how much damage we've done to them. And due to the amount of damage we've done to Ukraine, they will not be able to launch incursions or attacks against us at all in the near future because of our defense of our lands, and we have stopped them from joining NATO. So you could say that you've not only prevented some future catastrophe, but you've achieved something in relation to your original war goals. That looks a lot more appealing than rolling the dice on, well, let's see if we can deal with $100 billion supercharged Ukraine and our energy sector getting kind of... At that moment, something like that makes more sense to a leader like Putin if you can sell it to your population, which I believe he could at least try. And that's better than not being able to try. But we didn't get that type of behavior from Trump. But we are starting to see some different movements that have the tone of some behavior that could vaguely resemble that. Apparently, Team Trump, his advisors, are preparing options to try to pressure Russia to end the war. This is being reported by Bloomberg, and it's saying that people in his staff are trying to get him a set of options the way that, if the president is in the middle of a crisis or a security dilemma, that it's usually dealt with is that his staff will bring to him a list of options from less extreme to more extreme on how to deal with that problem, i.e., our ally is being attacked. Do we send a little bit of aid, a lot of aid, or direct troops? Less extreme to more extreme. Well, that is being offered to Trump on options to pressure Russia. What's going to be on these options? Could be secondary sanctions, could be the seizing of Russian assets and turning over those assets over to Ukraine. It could be more weapon sales to Ukraine. I doubt Trump is somebody who wants to send another aid package, even though that's probably the most clear-cut way to send the message that you are in it for the long haul. It could be any number of things. We really do not know. What we do know is that the Senate is acting without the president moving or not moving. Let me read this to you. Separately, Trump ally U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham said earlier this week that he had the commitment of 72 colleagues for a bill that would enact bone-crushing new sanctions on Russia and tariffs on countries that buy its oil, gas, and other key products if Putin doesn't engage in serious talks to halt the war. Those punishments would include a 500% tariff on imports from countries that buy Russian oil, petroleum products, natural gas, or uranium, according to a draft of the bill. So we're talking about Russian resources and the energy sector, which, heavily helps fund the war. And without it, Russia would not be able to fund the war. It's often talked about at what price per barrel you would have to get it down to break the Russian budget. And at $50 a barrel, you're already pushing it. But if you make it so people aren't even buying your barrels to begin with, well, that's a totally different crisis entirely than it going down the $30 or $25 or some 1990s Asia-style energy crisis. Whether or not Lindsey Graham is talking about 72 colleagues in the Senate or 72 colleagues across the Senate and the House, the fact Lindsey Graham feels comfortable enough to come out and talk about this does indicate that the tone is shifting. Whether it was Trump talking about Russia as someone who might not actually, a party that might actually not want to end the war, was the signal that was needed for this to happen. There are movements on this, and the colleagues that are for the bill is a coalition of both Democrat and Republican colleagues. So this is a bipartisan piece of legislation to increase the pressure on Russia. And let me just say, this would be a crushing tariff. This is the type of tariff that could send the Russian economy, if taken seriously, into a really dark place. Now, of course, these secondary sanctions don't necessarily mean that every single party that buys those products are going to say, I'm no longer going to buy them. If they're willing to deal with the lack of business with the United States, then I don't think the Iranians are really going to mind that much. It might be that other countries don't, but I kind of find it hard to believe that Trump is that close to pulling the trigger. Not only because, well, Trump has talked about this for so long, he has yet to pull the trigger on any consequence for the Russians, but also because the Indians are buying Russian energy export at a discounted price. Are we going to expect the government of Donald Trump to tell the Indians that they're going to place this type of a tariff on them for the consumption of those energy products at a discounted price? The Chinese is more believable to me because of the current trade war with China. But the Indians, I don't know. I guess would have a crushing impact. But is Trump willing to go through with this? Because I don't think Lindsey Graham is going to act completely separate of Donald Trump. If the legislation has a momentum of its own, then it has a momentum of its own. But doing this type of threat to a nation like India might make somebody even like Marco Rubio think twice. Now, I want to say it's not just the threat of these sanctions, because maybe they reform this a little bit or Trump starts with a lower level sanction. I don't know. But it's not just sanctions that we're seeing some shift in the United States about policy moving forward. Still, you need to see a trigger be pulled for it to be considered a real shift, in my opinion. But we are seeing some action when it comes to sales, weapons sales to Ukraine. Not aid, but weapons sales. For example, a few days ago, $50 million weapons sale was approved to Ukraine. Now, in the grand scheme of things, $50 million is peanuts. $50 billion maybe would have been more notable, but $50 million is peanuts. Now, the Ukrainian economy is under a lot of stress, so of course they're going to buy what they can, but it's not stopping at the $50 million, which was the first sale of weapons to Ukraine since Trump got inaugurated after a 4-month period, meaning that in the attempt for this peace attempt, we sat on our hands for 4 months. It's not just a $50 million deal now. The U.S. State Department just approved the sale of F-16 training services for Ukraine at a price tag of over $300 million. The U.S. State Department has approved a $310.5 million F-16 training program for Ukraine, signaling continued White House backing for Kyiv. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency confirmed the news in an official statement, noting that Ukraine had requested equipment and services in support of its F-16 aircraft. By the way, we heard a lot of downplaying of the exact effect the F-16 would have on the battlefield. And people saying like, well, the F-16 isn't going to be enough to like go deep into Russia and do bombings, or the F-16 isn't going to be enough to secure all of Ukraine's airspace, or the F-16, there's not going to be enough of them for them to like constantly doing missions on the front line to shoot down Russian aircraft. But what the F-16 has been very useful for the Russians, and there's tons of videos of this online, is taking missiles, taking bombs, and hitting forward operating positions for the Ruskies. And you can see video after video after video after video of this all across the front line. And it's been pretty devastating for the Russian frontline positions that have had to deal with it. And so those infantrymen on the front line that have been supported by the F-16 aircraft are very thankful. F-16 aircraft have also been used for the defense of Ukrainian airspace, but that's probably, these frontline strikes are probably where they have had the most immediate impact. The equipment and services include aircraft modification and upgrades, personnel training related to operation, maintenance, and sustainment support, along with spare parts. The proposed sale will improve Ukraine's security as it has been a force for political stability and economic progress in Europe. Additionally, the sale will improve Ukraine's ability to meet current and future threats by assuring its pilots are effectively trained and contribute to the overall modernization of the Ukrainian Air Force. So, let me show you something. This right here is footage of F-16 aircrafts being led into Ukrainian jets or Ukrainian transport vehicles that are going to take these over to Ukraine. So the way that War Translated, one of the really big pro-Ukraine accounts who, they're not terrible. They follow me, by the way, I don't have no problem with them. But in this instance, they say, so apparently the U.S. is sending retired F-16s from the Davis-Monthan Boneyard to Ukraine, supposedly just for spare parts to repair existing jets. Sure, just spare parts, nothing else to see here. And then he posts this footage. Okay, so let me just throw this out there. Yes, that is an F-16 jet. Yes, that looks like the whole jet. No, it is not the whole jet. If the thing is missing its internals and it's missing, for example, its engine, then what you have is a carcass. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take like some bone marrow out of a carcass. You can't take the liver out. You can't find, oh, look, if we could take some of the skin here to skin graft, or we could take this to do that. You can, but this is from a boneyard. This is not a functioning F-16 jet. This is one that they're sending the entire body of so the Ukrainians can scrap as much of it as possible, because you don't know. I mean, you might know what the Ukrainians need right now, but you might not know what spare part the Ukrainians might need tomorrow. And hell, it might not even be that. If you want to talk about another purpose this might have, somebody just brought this up in chat, Patches, being very smart, is either for parts or a decoy. That's another thing it could be. It could be that they go in there, scrap as much of the innards that are still left in it as possible for spare parts, and then take the chassis, take off maybe a little part of the wing or a wheel that they might need, and then put it out in an airfield and let the Russians use a really expensive, like $5 to $10 to $20 million missile to try to take out an old dead jet. So, point is, it's very possible that, and I think almost certain, or at least very likely, that this is a scrapper, even if it still is the entire body. But this is still useful. Now, I will point out that despite the fact the United States will often claim credit for approving F-16s being sent to Ukraine, we haven't sent any F-16s to Ukraine. What we did is we said, back during the Biden administration, that our allies can send their F-16s to Ukraine, which is a lot different than us sending F-16s to Ukraine. We have still yet to send Ukraine a single functional, working F-16 that can operate once being shipped. This is the closest we've gotten. Denmark and other nations have surpassed us on the amount of F-16s, functioning F-16s we have provided. If Spain was tomorrow to give one of its F-16s to the Ukrainians, they will have surpassed us as well. It will not have been that hard. But putting all that aside, the spare parts are still useful. The training software and the support services are still useful. The weapon sales are useful, both in the physical sense, even though in the grand scheme of things, they're still considered peanuts for the whole war, in reference to how much aid they need to actually change the frontline situation in a meaningful way that could compel the Russians. But it also has diplomatic implications. If you're the Russians and you're seeing this, and you just had the footage played on the Kremlin flat screen of American F-16s, spare parts or not, being loaded into Antonov transport aircraft, while weapon sales are being approved, and support services for Ukrainian pilots, which are hitting your soldiers on the front line, are being approved, what is the message that's sent? Well, the message that could be sent is Donald Trump might actually be more serious about sending weapons to Ukraine than previously thought. Now, maybe not aid, which could still be, of course, the Russians a comfort that the clearest, fastest way to get support to Ukraine still seems to be, at least for the time being, off the table. But a weapon like whether a bullet was purchased or given an aid, at the end of the day, a bullet is still a bullet. And it'll be a question of how much the United States will allow the Ukrainians to buy and how much the Ukrainians can buy. But I remember very distinctly not too long ago, the Ukrainian president asking to be able to buy $15 billion worth of air defense systems. $15 billion is a big weapons deal. It is a big purchase, and what Trump could sell as a big victory at the moment, with all of the political pressure on him, and with the polling indicating clearly that the American people think that he has handled both Ukraine and Russia poorly, that could show a shift. And not only a shift, it could also show a deliver on a campaign promise. I did not just come here and be tough on the Russians. I'm now supporting Ukraine at no cost to us. They're now paying us for our support. We're now getting our fair share. We're no longer being ripped off by the globalists and the woke cabal or whatever it is. We're now getting paid for our support. It's no longer an aid program. It's now a deal where the United States is getting paid. And you stack that on top of the mineral deal. Well, it seems that Donald Trump could sell a lot of victories on the Ukrainian side. The mineral deal is a victory. Weapon sales, big weapon sales, getting the Ukrainians to pay for it is a victory. Getting the Ukrainians to agree to the ceasefire was a victory. What victories have the Russians given Trump? What victories have the Russians put on a silver platter and say, Trump, take this? I don't believe normalizations would be considered a victory amongst most of American society, especially if the war is still ongoing. What victories has he given them? None. I mean, there was opportunities. I'm not saying that there wasn't chances for them to give them victories. For example, when they agreed to the energy ceasefire, if they would have abided by it, that could have been something. When they agreed in private to the civilian ceasefire that Trump announced, if they abided by that and civilians weren't dying, Trump could go on TV and say, look, we're protecting civilians. It was my negotiating that saved those Ukrainian children at the playground. But we saw what happened in Kiev and Ri. We see what's happening in Kherson on the daily with the human safari. We saw what happened in Odessa. We saw what happened in Kiev. We see what's continuing to happen. And so the Russians are not giving Trump any victories. The Russians are making it very, 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 very difficult to be their friend. The closest we've gotten to anything like that would be when Steve Witkoff was on Tucker Carlson's podcast talking about how Trump was prayed for by Putin after the assassination attempt, and he got a painting of himself. But a victory that can be sold to the public, that is not. Even if it's something Trump can brag about at his country club. And so at this point, we're seeing this. And look, I don't want to get your guys' hopes up. I really don't. Marco Rubio right now is both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. That could be having some impact because I hear about the divides in the administration, and those in the administration want to apply more pressure to the Russians. You want to know who almost certainly is at the head of that list? Who is now both Trump's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. It could be that. But in 6 months, reportedly, when they're going to maybe think about replacing Marco Rubio as National Security Advisor, if they give that position to Elbridge Colby, or they give that position to Mike Lee, or I don't know why they would. That'd be very dumb politics. After getting Mike Waltz to leave his House seat and get the Republicans to pay so much on that reelection, you're going to do that to Mike Lee? I don't think it'd be very smart. You already pissed Mike Johnson off with the Mike Lee pick. You're going to piss off Senator Thune in the Senate as well. Right now, we see Donald Trump allowing weapons to go to Ukraine, allowing support to go to Ukraine, not aid, sales. Ukraine is paying to get use out of things to defend themselves. As far as I know, cybersecurity aid was still cut off. As far as I know, the amount of intelligence support that's being provided before is not being provided now. So we're still not okay. We've realized that the Russians have not adjusted their position enough. We're back. We need to go back to the support we were providing before. What we are seeing is both a diplomatic and physical manifestation of a possible pathway for Trump to increase pressure. And so we cannot say that there's an excuse. Trump has the tools to sell them weapons, which is just to allow the weapons to be sold. He also has the tools to send aid. He just chooses not to use it. If Donald Trump tomorrow went out in the public and said, we're going to send aid to Ukraine, like I promised on the campaign show, because the Russians have not come to the negotiating table and negotiated in good faith. If he did that, the Republicans in the House would follow suit. The Republicans in the Senate would follow suit. He'd get people online pissed at him. But a midterm is a year and a half away anyway. If you somehow think that's going to have an impact, I doubt it. I doubt the person that would be angry at aid getting cut off from Ukraine is going to say, my deciding factor for not supporting the Republicans this election or Donald Trump is because he sent an aid package to Ukraine. I just don't. I don't think they're going to flip to the Democrats over that because the Democrats are going to be even more gung-ho about Ukraine. If Trump keeps this path, if Marco keeps him on this path, and they start expanding the sales, maybe adding some aid packages, and finally pulling the trigger on sanctions on Russia. One, to add more pressure to their economy, to make the gears of war stop turning because they don't have the energy, then maybe the Russians will double take a step back, and reconsider slamming their head against the wall that is the Dnieper River. Getting Trump to actually do any of this is very separate from me saying what he should, though. I'd appreciate any support you threw towards the channel at DylanBurns.tv, Dylan Burns TV on Twitch. You can throw the primer, or Dylan Burns TV on Patreon. You guys have a good one. Good night and good luck.